Hello friends, and thank you for joining me today on this video presentation. I've been teaching, my name is Warren Hoyt, and I've been teaching for the last several weeks because a Mexican pastor friend invited me to do some teaching in Spanish. And so since I was doing it in Spanish, I thought I would also do some in English. And each one that I do in Spanish, I then do one in English over the same topic. So this week in Spanish, I presented something that I don't usually do. I presented someone else's material. I usually present my own, but I've been involved with something called the Third Education Revolution for about a year and a half now, just sort of around the periphery of it. I've been learning things about it, interacting some with some of the leaders, and I went to a conference on it. I did a training up in Minneapolis for it. And as a result, I did a school of education from Chile, and then a school of government and education, government and economy, from Spain. And I've been tutoring children and so forth. So it's got me fired up, and I've been involved with these guys off and on. So Dr. Vishal Mangalwadi presented a paper just last month over in the UK in London to a group called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, the ARC. And his paper was titled Recovering Optimism and Responsibility. And it has like a subtitle, Taking Strategic Action to Change the Future. Well, I was impressed by the paper. I was touched by it once again, and it's why I'm still involved in the Third Education Revolution, because it strikes a chord in me, and I believe it's something very important. So I want to today in this video just sort of give the highlights of this paper that Dr. Mangalwadi presented. And of course, I can't do it as well as he, but I want to give you the main points because not everybody gets exposed to this or gets a chance to hear of this or see this. So that's my goal today in sharing this with you. He begins by sort of an intro in which he talks about postmodern pessimism. He says Nobel laureate Rudyard Kipling, who lived from 1865 to 1936, was a Freemason, expressed the British mood of his day when he encouraged the USA to colonize the Philippines. He said it was the white man's burden to civilize their captives, their sullen peoples, half devil and half child. He wrote that in 1899. 2 years earlier, India-born Kipling, the author of The Jungle Book, had already confessed the hollowness of the white man's mission. Replacing theological foundations of missions with racial underpinning had undermined the nobility of, quote-unquote, responsibility. And Kipling lamented, "Far called our navies melt away on dune and headland sinks the fire. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. Judge of the nations, spare us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget." That was something called the Recessional. It was done in written in 1897. Vishal goes on to say, since his time, or Kipling's time, history's dustbin has been swallowing up the race-based mission, just as it finished off powerful colonizers like Nineveh, Tyre, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and Spain. Desperate Britain has been forced to accept a brown Hindu as its temporary messiah, referring there, of course, to their prime minister, who is a Hindu from India now. And a brown Muslim is struggling to manage London's chaos. So a Muslim mayor of London, right? On July 5th, 2023, The Guardian published its research that in parenthesis, non-responsible, quote, Britons are staying happy by divorcing themselves from the fortunes of the wider world. Britain has a growing body of pessimists who believe that the future will no longer be better than the past. Vishal asks, is America faring better? And he says the Pew Research Center published its sobering finding on December 16th of 2013. Americans are more pessimistic than optimistic about the institution of marriage and family. So British are pessimistic. The Americans are pessimistic too, especially about the institution of marriage and family. And so Vishal says a people that cannot save their marriage cannot possibly save their children, churches, nation, or the environment. Non-Western nations sign on to grand resolutions to save the planet, but everybody knows they're simply participating in elitist hypocrisy. In seeking mystical enlightenment, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, abandoned his wife and his son. He indulged in tantric sex as well as an extreme asceticism. When both failed, he began advocating the, quote, middle way, unquote. Renouncing marriage has remained a requirement for the enlightenment seekers, whether Buddhist or Hindus. For the command to love your wives is hard. It's much easier to love your neighbor's wife because she doesn't ask you to change her baby's diapers. That's why loving one's own family has to be more than a private value. If loving your family is an obligation, then who has the right to demand that I sacrifice my self-interest to love my family? Okay, I think that it says if it is an obligation, but I think what he meant to say there is if loving your family is not an obligation, then who has the right to demand that I sacrifice my self-interest to love my family? Loving your neighbor, he goes on to say, is harder if he's your competitor and if his race, caste, religion, language, and culture differ from yours. Being a responsible citizen goes beyond loving your neighbor to love your enemies, personal, racial, ideological, economic, political, or religious. What if you have good reason to hate your enemy? Are you still under a moral obligation to ensure that he's treated fairly under law, the courts, the police, the press, the market, the government, and even in a war? Does being a responsible citizen mean to become your enemy's keeper? And then he speaks about Mohandas Gandhi, a lawyer in South Africa, how he became the Mahatma, a great soul, when he learned that taking responsibility for the downtrodden was a moral obligation. In his case, an anti-cultural value. It was actually anti-cultural. In 1904, during an overnight train journey, Gandhi read John Ruskin's exposition of Matthew 25:34 through 46. In that passage, Jesus said that we would be held accountable for being irresponsible toward the sick, the hungry, the oppressed, the homeless, the marginalized, the unjustly imprisoned and brutalized. To be a good neighbor means to be a good Samaritan, to serve those hated by your religious culture. Gandhi translated and paraphrased Ruskin's book unto this last into Gujarati in 1909, and he retitled it as Sarvodaya, upliftment of all. He returned to India to challenge the British Raj, but Christ's message compelled him to also challenge his own Hindu religious culture. For 3,000 years it had crushed over 85% of the lower castes. Devout Hindus assassinated Mahatma Gandhi for demanding that India ought to be fair to Muslim Pakistan. After him, Gandhi's own party derailed the mission for annihilation of caste. B.R. Ambedkar, the guy who wrote that. Thankfully, the good seeds have continued to grow in a soil covered with thorns and thistles. The mission to uplift the downtrodden is getting back on political track, albeit mainly as a vote-garnering mantra. No politician has presented a practical strategy to move India's backward castes forward. So all of that about Kipling and talking about racial, speaking of things in racial terms, that it's the white man's burden to help the brown peoples of the world and so forth, and how that failed, how the Brits are pessimistic, how the Americans are pessimistic, how Mahatma Gandhi tried to, he was inspired by biblical exposition to do things for the poor and so forth, but he ended up being killed for trying to. So then Vishal says, that's the background for the following proposal, although I can justify it from Africa, Latin America, and other countries in Asia. I'll discuss the assumptions behind this proposal and answer some questions after presenting the strategy itself. So this is the heart of the matter here. This is what I was inspired by and wanted to share with you. It's called, he just has a subtitle, An Actionable Proposal. And then Vishal writes, imagine students enroll in an accredited university or school but attend classes in their own homes, community centers, or churches. Every day, thousands of teachers, professors, and experts come to students online. Poorest students get to learn from the world's best teachers. Each lesson is peer-reviewed and produced by experts in online pedagogy and competent videographers. Schools and universities test and grade students. Also imagine while subject matter experts, SMEs, impart instructions to students, academic pastors or pastors, and he abbreviates academic pastors henceforth by saying APs. They shepherd, and I'll talk about that later, but they shepherd or mentor students just as homeschooling parents do. Okay? School students, rich or poor, get online tuition for free. University students save 75% or more on tuition because online, one teacher can instruct millions of students. Schools and universities no longer need to build and maintain classrooms. Small groups of students meet for online classes, studies, projects, and discussions in existing facilities, such as local churches, under the moral supervision of community elders. At the undergraduate level, universities will teach those students that require specialized labs for practicals or one-on-one coaching. Their main role, however, will be to research, debate, improve curricula, test, and grade students. Living at home will allow students to contribute to their family's economy and communities. Those who cannot live with their parents will room and board with elders trained to teach life skills, personal, relational, and vocational. This system of education is called Palikudam in the Malayalam, like it's hard to say that one, Malayalam language, the language of India, Malayalam. Okay, that is what made Kerala, the southernmost state of India, that's what made Kerala the most educated state in mainland Italy. Digo, mainland India. Perdón. Okay, literally, this word Palikudam means the building next to my church. Okay, Palikudam, the building next to my church in Malayalam. Malayalam. There, I said it. Okay, interesting, eh? And so Vishal says, my proposal is to A, enrich the Palikudam tradition with available technology to bring the best teachers and libraries into the smallest classroom. B, add college courses and non-formal education. C, train parents and priests to become academic pastors or APs using online pedagogy and small group learning hubs. And D, organize parents, students, and academic pastors into educational cooperatives to support and oversee this education revolution, including its financial challenges. Palikudam, that is, the building next to the church or in the church as a center for education, came to Kerala from Europe, where local churches ran parish schools, often one-room schools. That model enabled the community to keep moral oversight over education. Protestants and Jesuits had borrowed that model from ancient Israel, where the synagogues educated the youth. During weekdays, when fathers went to work, Jewish students went to the synagogue to study. Their teacher was the local rabbi or priest, trained in the temple in Jerusalem. So that made the temple, listen to this important, that made the temple the nation's intellectual capital or university. That's why the supposed 12-year-old son of a carpenter called Joseph took his questions to the scholars in the temple. The madrasa schools of Islam and Hindu gurukuls had also developed some similarities with this kind of education. The Roman Catholic Church improved upon the Jewish model by developing cathedral schools such as Notre Dame in Paris, developing them into universities. The Protestant movement required every parish priest to be responsible for supporting illiterate families to educate their children. That's why the Western missionary movement took education to the non-Western world. These are some of the things I've been teaching about in my recent videos. Of course, parents and guardians are responsible to ensure that their children receive the best available nutrition, healthcare, and education, right? Parents and guardians are responsible to ensure that the children under their care receive the best available nutrition, healthcare, and education, of course. But when they're not able to diagnose or give the best treatment to a sick child, they depend on the available expertise, So you're responsible for the child, but that doesn't mean you have to be a doctor. You can take them to a doctor. You know that they need that. Likewise, if parents are uneducated or unable to educate their children, they have to take help from experts. Parents remain responsible even when they delegate medical or educational authority to experts. So the idea is the parent cares and the parent is responsible, but it doesn't mean they have to be an expert in education or any more than they are in medicine. They're responsible for their children. If they see they have a need, they get them to a doctor. So that's the idea Vishal is promoting here. And then he says an academic pastor or an AP trained to mentor students in a relational context ought to be available to every student, parent, or guardian. This pastoral role makes an AP more than a class teacher. See, he or she is not just a teacher. Instead, he or she becomes a shepherd who knows and loves his sheep in every student's family. So in this learner-centric hybrid education, the AP makes sure that his cohort of students study and understand a lesson. When a student finds it difficult to comprehend a lesson, the AP will organize face-to-face coaching or online webinars to help that student. That coach may be a fellow student or may be an expert. This character and leadership building education will require students to love and serve others. Students will devote at least 6 hours a week to serve others, individuals with specific needs or families or groups. Older students will be helped to research specific needs in their community in order to develop practical projects to solve these problems. So that's an interesting idea. You have to assign community service to the students. It builds their character and makes them outward focused. But it also makes the students and the APs and all study what the needs are in the community so that the school becomes sort of a problem-solving institution, not just solving the problem of educating the youth, but also solving other problems out in the community. The AP will ensure that students go to science labs, universities, and other institutions to learn what cannot be taught online or in a parish school. So they'll augment. You don't get everything that you need in the online studies, of course. You need to go to laboratories and do experiments or whatever. So the AP coordinates that. They'll organize internships also for individual students to gain practical experience of different professions. So connecting them with businesses in the community, business people, helping them get practical experience. Every parent, pastor, or teacher mentoring students will be assisted to learn online pedagogy, the art of coaching skills, and the pastoral role in character formation. The program will enable APs to earn diplomas and accredited degrees in theory and practice of education, which integrates community leadership, technology, and Vishal always talks about this, veritas and virtue. Veritas is truth, and virtue means, the virtue and the character qualities that you need. So the pastor or the AP, as well as or if it's a parent, they get assistance. They learn about how to educate and how to coach these children under their care and so forth. They learn their pastoral roles, so they get some education as well, and they get accreditation in it. At the moment of this writing, Vishal goes on to say, a virtual wisdom village is being designed in a metaverse to serve as the hub of this education revolution. So this is another thing that the Third Education Revolution has been involved with, the idea of the metaverse and developing this thing called the Wisdom Village. So it's a virtual village, and he says it's going to be built on the banks of the virtual river of life. And different creeks flow out of the river to create Edenic islands, like Eden, right? On one bank of the river are academic institutions, elementary school, middle school, high school, universities, and specialty schools. The child would enroll in the elementary school while the parent or the AP educating that child will enroll in college to learn how to teach and mentor the child. So you put the child in the school and you put the AP in a training as well. To repeat, Vishal says, at school level, students' tuition would be free. Parents or APs who are earning an accredited degree in education would pay a small fee to cover the operation. And he goes on to say, for example, excuse me, 1 million homeschooling parents or APs in the USA, if each one paid $1,000 to earn a BA or MA degree, and that's a low price to pay, but if each of them contributed $1,000, that would contribute $1 billion per year. So if you had 1 million homeschooling parents, each contributing $1,000, that contributes $1 billion a year to change the future of global education. And it would help rescue education from learned professors who don't know or at least can't define male or female, and therefore have made themselves incapable of understanding sex, love, marriage, family, and divorce. So again, the idea is take back education, reclaim education, make education what it should be instead of what it's become. On the other bank of the river of life are islands with virtual institutions to study cosmology, earth sciences, life sciences, museums of civilization, halls of fame for influential thinkers, writers, innovators, scientists, artists, musicians, statesmen, etc. One island's devoted to languages and dictionaries, another to journalism and history, another to a library, and another to something Vishal calls Collegepedia. The idea here is people in the third education revolution want to take the idea of Wikipedia, but have a more truth-based encyclopedia, online encyclopedia, because Wikipedia is filled with biases. So the idea is to reclaim that, to create something that's better than that. A global network of scholars and professors is being built up to create the Collegepedia and use that storehouse of knowledge to create academic curricula. There's a lot of professors and PhDs in this TER movement. The Collegepedia would be available throughout the world, of course, just as Wikipedia is. The Wisdom Village would partner with accredited universities and institutions to offer diplomas, degrees, and research communities in various spheres of knowledge, service, and leadership, including business, medical, agricultural, legal, literature, arts, media, counseling, civil services, and governance. Grassroots level educational opportunities and microfinancing will build the capacity of resource-deprived communities to become centers of hybrid education and excellence, utilizing the best available technology, curricula, and professional training. For now, this movement is called the Third Education Revolution, which is abbreviated TER, after a book authored, Vishal says, by 30 of us. So Vishal and David Marshall were the editors. There's 30 authors in all. Each one writes a chapter in this book, Third Education Revolution. I've read the book, and that's what fired me up for this. Besides mobilizing scholars and professors to create a truth and virtue-based ecosystem of knowledge, TER is also mobilizing local churches and communities to fill the earth with wholesome knowledge generated and gathered in the Wisdom Village. The Third Education Revolution, Vishal says, it is a revolution because it aims to take education back from the state and the destructive ideologies and make it pursuit of wisdom under the authority of parents and the community leaders they trust. Now he says this, and this is important. Won't this revolution be opposed by governments, teacher unions, ideologues, media, and powerful vested interests? Won't it be opposed? He says, yes, it will be opposed. And then he says, can the status quo be changed, given that the European church surrendered the ministry of education to the state 2 centuries ago, and the North American church followed the European folly a century ago? This is something I've mentioned in previous videos as well. We abdicated. Education used to be by the pastors, by the churches, at least in New England and so forth, by the Christian church, by the parents. The parents were responsible for educating. But about a century ago, we said, because of guys like Horace Mann and then John Dewey, it was like, no, let the state do it. Yeah, it's better. We're big now. We can all pay taxes and the state will fund it. And this has gotten us where we are today with the pessimism that Vishal mentioned at the beginning of this paper, the pessimism of Britain, the pessimism of America. We've gotten there because one of the main reasons is the authority of parents and the church to educate has been usurped. Vishal goes on to say, yes, the revolution won't be a cakewalk because the Western church has amassed, listen to this, theological stories to justify irresponsibility, pessimism, and resignation. And I wish you could hear more about this. This is something I've only come to see in the last few years, but even a libertarian that I respect had a program the other day about how the rapture theory and how things are going to go from bad to worse, and the whole predispensational view of eschatology, last days, has made many American Christians sort of pessimistic and fatalistic and just say, well, you know, it's going to go from bad to worse. People told me that in churches I preached at. Well, you can't, it's no use getting involved in politics or anything because it's all going to go to hell anyway. You know, we're just waiting for the rapture. And so we've become fatalistic, we've become pessimistic, we have become irresponsible. And actually, we have theologies that have caused that to happen. People think the future is just predetermined and it's going to go from bad to worse. But Vishal asks, can the future be better? And he says, South Asia's mystical enlightenment began with the Buddha's pessimistic noble truth, you know, the 8 noble truths, that life is suffering. Okay, that's one of the noble truths of Buddhism. Therefore, the only way to end suffering is to escape life into nirvana. That's what the Buddha said. At least one of the fathers of Europe's rationalist enlightenment, Thomas Hobbes, agreed with the Buddha's observation, because Hobbes said, life is nasty, brutish, and short. Greek stories, epics, and tragedies explained the self-evident misery by imagining that the cosmos must be governed by a capricious deity such as destiny, fate, fortune, or the constellations. An individual's goodness may appear heroic, but it contributes nothing to the final results. Life's report card is determined not by an individual's merit or effort, but by a whimsical fate. Destiny doesn't care whether you serve or you oppress your neighbors. A person's tragic end through sickness, hunger, natural disasters, crime, or war couldn't permit Greek storytellers to postulate the possibility that the universe may be ruled by a sovereign judge who might reward Job's unyielding commitment to righteousness. See, the Greeks didn't have that concept. Classic storytellers didn't lack imagination, but in their worldview, it was counterintuitive to conjure up a saga like The Lord of the Rings. Its happy ending rests on the possibility that the cosmos may be governed by a sovereign who punishes Nietzschean pursuit of will to power while watching over little hobbits who risk their lives to save others. Vishal says, Hollywood storytellers have failed to find credible grounds for believing that good and evil are more than private perceptions. Some of them suspect that good and evil flow from the same, the force is with this one. Meditating upon the force empowers one to become either a Jedi or a Sith. So he's just talking about how the worldviews of different groups in the world today don't make for optimism. They don't produce it because they have no basis for it. Socrates was not the only wise man who paid with his life to learn the bitter lesson that wisdom and virtue don't guarantee happy endings. Asian wizards and sorcerers already knew what Hollywood's now learning, that in a multiverse governed by different deities, force, or fate, the smart thing is to fear, appease, flatter, and serve the dark side. Bowing before the devil yields better results than an unbending commitment to principles, conscience, and character. History-changing reformations couldn't begin in Asia, because taking up one's cross to confront evil is a pathway to defeat. At least that's how they saw it. And then Vishal says, ... unless resurrection is assured. Fatalistic Europe became the engine of global progress because it opened itself to a non-European idea that the future need not degenerate from the golden age into a dark age, that slaves can be liberated and led into lands flowing with milk and honey. That optimism made it possible for Western missionaries to sacrifice their self-interest and assume responsibility for the illiterate, the poor, the sick, and the crushed, widows and orphans. Here in England, the modern age dawned because reformers such as William Tyndale, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer stopped seeking church-state patronage. And they accepted being burned alive for truth because they didn't think of themselves as the saviors. They knew their own depravity, but they also knew the true meaning of human dignity as articulated by Pico della Mirandola in 1486. Asian sages thought that man enters the waters and causes no ripples. Man cannot change given order. By human dignity, Mirandola meant that man is not a cog in a cosmic machine. He enters the waters and creates ripples that never cease. Man makes history. He's different from all other creatures because he alone was made in God's image. He can transcend his social and physical environment for the better or for the worse. He can turn deserts into a garden and end deeply entrenched evils like slavery or untouchability. Mirandola learnt that man was so precious that when he sold himself into slavery, not to Egypt and Pharaoh, but to sin and Satan, God himself came to this earth to liberate him. He redeemed slaves to restore their sonship. Sonship means kingship, if your father happens to be king. And so Europe's discovery of the Bible's doctrine of human dignity demolished fatalism, for it meant that man had the potential to become greater than angels. And so I got to wrap up, but in the rest of the paper, he talks about how superior it is. The knowledge of the gospel makes us superior liberators, even better than Moses, because we come to understand who the liberator really is in Christ. And the Almighty is like a father who knows and forgives his children's fragility. So the Bible has given us a vision of the healing of the nations in Revelation 22 that makes it possible to think that life doesn't have to be suffering. We can battle against it. But Vishal says we are faced with human depravity, and that means that salvation requires repentance. That is to own the moral responsibility for one's false ideas and wrong choices. Repentance is the beginning of self-governance, the foundation of freedom. And so, contrary to what Rudyard Kipling's imagination, European explorers and merchants and mercenaries didn't sail to the Americas, Africa, or Asia in order to civilize the barbarians. They sailed for profit and power. But now listen to this. He wraps up with this, and I hope I can get through it in time. But he says, 300 years after Columbus, an English cobbler, William Carey, came to Bengal to engage my people, Vishal says, with reforming ideas, principles, and values. It was a clash of ideas, not a clash of arms, that reformed culture. Those who followed Carey to take responsibility for their neighbors were called missionaries because they went out to serve God, not mammon. Carey's mission made him the father of modern South Asia. His outlook was informed by Europe's historic transformation from tyranny into liberty, from poverty into progress. Millions followed or supported Carey's call to mission to counter the corruption of Europe's trading companies, the East India Trading Company, as well as the corruption of the colonized victims. These good Samaritans loved their neighbors because they became children of God who loves the world. And the missionary obligation was not a part of Europe's traditional culture. William Carey's well-wishers said to him, "Hey man, what you're going to do? They'll kill you for going over there to help them. They'll kill you." And the thing is, that's true. They would, It's a dangerous thing. But he said, look, the fact that they'd be hostile to me like that, that's just more of a reason for me to go. It's more of a responsibility to serve God and lost children because they're in darkness. That's why they would do that. And I got to go and bring them light. And so the British East India Company had been administering Bengal on behalf of the Mughal Empire since 1765, but it had no interest in educating Bengal. Far from fighting corruption, the British East India Company's officers took full advantage of the corruption of India's character. The British, who believed that, or a people who believed that gods have to be appeased, were quite willing to bribe British rulers. And so that's why British historian Lord Macaulay wrote that in the first phase of governing Bengal, the East India Company, British East India Company, was a gang of public robbers. It was governance by the rule of an evil genie, he said. But William Carey had optimism that even that company's corruption could be eradicated, and the Bengalis could become better because of the biblical understanding that he had. It came from his experience that God saves repentant sinners. And in his historic manifesto, Inquiry into Use of Means, to reach the heathen, he answered his critics and said this: the uncivilized state of the heathen, instead of affording an objection against preaching the good news to them, ought to furnish an argument for it. Can we as men or as Christians hear that a great part of our fellow creatures whose souls are as immortal as ours and who are as capable as us are enveloped in ignorance and barbarism? Can we hear that they're without the gospel, without government, without laws, and without arts and sciences, and not exert ourselves to introduce among them the sentiments of men and of Christians? Would not the spread of the gospel be the most effectual means of their civilization? Would not that make them useful members of society? See, he's saying that the answer is the gospel. And then I'll wrap up, but Vishal goes on to talk about all that William Carey did, and he's written a book about it. William Carey, let's see, what's the title of it? It's called, anyway, I can't remember. But William Carey, was the father of missions. We learned that in YWAM. But he was just a shoemaker, a cobbler. But he went to India and he had a huge impact. He learned many languages. And he believed that the mind was God's supreme gift to mankind. So he translated languages, because language is the way in which the mind expresses itself. And he started colleges. And he got people to learn their own languages and develop written languages. And he even trained British civil servants so that their corruption would be mitigated, would be eliminated through the gospel. And then Vishal has a long quote from Peter Drucker, who's a management guru, and he talks about how the civil servants that Carey trained actually held India together for 2 centuries. And they were people that weren't like star material. They weren't like, rock stars. They were just regular mundane folks. But the training that they received from him caused them to be sort of a stabilizing factor in India. Oh, here's the title I was looking for. The Father of Modern India, William Carey. That's the book that Vishal and Ruth wrote about. So William Carey, Vishal says, is an example of why we can have optimism. You can't have optimism. You don't get any optimism from what Hollywood says, or from the idea of the force, or from Hinduism, or from Greek mythology, or from the secularism that we have today. No, the only real basis for optimism is the gospel and its biblical truth. And that's why we need to be part of this third education revolution, to promote education of the truth, because it changes people's lives. I guess that's all the time I have for this time, but I hope you got something out of that. If you have any questions about how to reach Vishal Mangalwadi or join the third education revolution, or if you just want to talk to me about what I read here today, feel free to contact me at my email, hwarrenhoyt@gmail.com. Till next time, thank you for your time and for accompanying me, and may the Lord richly bless you.